It was just another uneventful night at the gas station located on the outskirts of town. The place was eerily quiet, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights and neon signs. I had settled into my usual routine, checking the pumps, restocking the shelves, and occasionally flipping through an old magazine. Around midnight, I noticed a black SUV pull into the lot. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. In fact, it had been showing up every night for the past week. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, this was a gas station, and people stopped by at all hours. But something about this vehicle stood out. It was always impeccably clean, even in the middle of the night. The driver never got out, instead choosing to sit in the shadows, making it nearly impossible to get a good look at them. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work, but no matter what I did, my eyes kept drifting back to that SUV. It moved around the lot, parking in different spots each night, as if trying to remain inconspicuous. Yet its presence was anything but. The first few nights I shrugged it off as a coincidence. Maybe the driver was just passing through or waiting for someone. But the more it happened, the more unsettled I became. I found myself glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until dawn, when the SUV would disappear just as mysteriously as it had arrived. One night I decided to keep a closer eye on it. I pretended to be engrossed in my tasks, but made sure to stay within sight of the vehicle. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement inside, a shadow shifting or the faint glow of a cell phone screen. Who was this person, and why did they keep coming here? The questions gnawed at me, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but something about this whole situation felt off. I told myself I was just overthinking it, that there was a perfectly logical explanation. But as the nights wore on, the SUV became a dark cloud hanging over my otherwise quiet shifts. I knew I needed to stay alert just in case my instincts were right. I glanced at the clock again, 2 more hours until sunrise. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for another long night, another night at the gas station. The air was still, the kind of silence that could make you feel alone in the world. I was going through my routine, restocking the shelves and checking the pumps. It was around 1 a.m. when the now familiar black SUV pulled into the lot. This time, something was different. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was of average height and build, dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled up over his head, obscuring his face. My heart skipped a beat as he started walking toward the station. I plastered a polite smile on my face as he approached the counter. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Need any help?" "Just looking around," he replied, his voice calm and friendly. "Quiet night, huh?" "Yeah, pretty quiet," I responded, forcing myself to relax. "Not much traffic around this time." He nodded, glancing around the station. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, almost too deliberate, too controlled. I tried to keep the conversation going, hoping to get some clue about why he was here. "So, do you live around here?" I asked casually. He shrugged. "Not too far. I come by every now and then. Nice to get out of the house, you know?" "Yeah, I get that," I said, nodding. "It's always good to get some fresh air." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Jake," I answered, hesitating for a moment. "What's yours?" "Call me John," he said, the smile never leaving his face. "So, Jake, how long have you been working here?" "About a year," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's a decent job." He nodded again, his gaze drifting back to the SUV. "Do you like it here?" "It's all right," I replied, feeling increasingly on edge. "Quiet, like you said." "Quiet can be good," he mused. "Less stress, less drama." I chuckled awkwardly. "Yeah, that's true." There was a brief silence, and I seized the opportunity to probe a bit. "So, John, what brings you here so late at night?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Just passing through, I guess. Sometimes it's nice to take a drive when you can't sleep." I nodded, but his answer felt evasive. "Do you have family around here?" "Not really," he said, his tone still friendly but distant. "Just me and the open road." Before I could ask more, he glanced at his watch. "Well, I should get going. Thanks for the chat, Jake." "No problem," I said, watching as he walked back to his SUV. Take care." "You too," he replied, getting into the vehicle. I watched as he drove off, disappearing into the night. As the taillights faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to John than he was letting on. His answers had been polite, but vague, and the way he moved, the way he watched me, it all felt too calculated. I made a mental note to stay extra alert during my shifts. Something told me this wasn't the last I'd see of him. The nights at the gas station had grown colder, a light breeze whispering through the empty lot. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake off the chill. The memory of my encounter with John still lingered in my mind, making me uneasy. Despite our conversation, the black SUV continued to show up every night. What was different now was that it always parked closer to the station, almost as if he wanted me to see it. The vehicle would settle into a spot where I could see it from the counter, even if it meant parking in an awkward position. My instincts were screaming that something was off. The polite smile and friendly demeanor from our first conversation did nothing to ease my growing discomfort. Each night, I'd catch myself glancing over at the SUV, my eyes drawn to it as if by some magnetic force. I decided I couldn't just brush it off anymore. I needed to be cautious to protect myself. I started jotting down the license plate number of the SUV and making note of any peculiarities in John's behavior. Every time he arrived, I'd discreetly observe him from behind the counter, trying to discern his intentions. One night, as I restocked the shelves near the window, I noticed John sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight at the station. His face was still obscured by the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me. I shivered, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I knew I had to take this seriously. I began writing down the times he arrived and left, noting any changes in his routine. It felt like a small measure of control in an otherwise unsettling situation. I also made sure to have my phone within reach at all times, ready to call for help if things escalated. The nights stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. John continued to park closer and closer, and my anxiety grew with each visit. I started looking over my shoulder more often, the shadows around the station seeming darker and more threatening. One particularly cold night, as I was finishing up some paperwork, I glanced outside and saw John's SUV parked right next to the building. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to stay calm. I picked up my notebook and wrote down the time, the position of the vehicle, and any other details I could observe. As I scribbled in my notes, I realized just how much this had consumed my thoughts. I was constantly on edge, my mind racing with questions and fears. Who was John, really? What did he want? And why did he keep coming back? I knew I had to be vigilant, to trust my instincts. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, and I couldn't afford to ignore it. I took a deep breath, resolving to stay alert and ready for whatever might come next. The cold wind howled outside, but inside the station, I felt a fire burning in my gut, a determination to uncover the truth and keep myself safe. The nights dragged on, each one colder and longer than the last. The black SUV had become a fixture at the station, a dark presence that weighed heavily on my mind. I was exhausted, the constant vigilance taking its toll. The psychological pressure was intense, and I felt like I was being hunted. One night, as I restocked the shelves, I noticed the SUV pulling into its usual spot. I sighed, bracing myself for another tense encounter. John stepped out, his hood pulled up as always, and walked toward the station. This time, though, there was a new intensity in his eyes. "Hey, Jake," he greeted me, his tone overly friendly. "How's it going?" "Fine," I replied curtly, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on me. "You must work a lot of night shifts, huh? Don't you get tired?" "A little," I said, keeping my answers short. "It's part of the job." John nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Do you live around here? Must be tough balancing work and personal life." I felt a spike of anxiety. "I manage," I replied, not giving him anything more. "What's your schedule like? Do you always work nights?" His questions were becoming more intrusive, more personal. I forced a smile. "Depends on the week," I said vaguely. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "It's good to know the people who work around here." As soon as he left, I knew I had to take more decisive action. I couldn't keep living in this constant state of fear. The next day, I purchased a small, discreet surveillance camera and installed it outside the station, ensuring it was well hidden. Each morning, I reviewed the footage, noting every detail of John's visits. This gave me a small measure of comfort, but the anxiety remained. John started showing up multiple times a night, parking in the same spot each time. It felt like he was pushing boundaries, testing my resolve. I knew I had to protect myself, to take control of the situation before it escalated. I made copies of the surveillance recordings and saved them on multiple devices, just in case something happened. Every night, I grew more determined to catch John in the act. As the weather grew colder and the nights seemed endless, I formulated a plan. I would lure John out of his car and keep him occupied until the police arrived. It was risky, but I couldn't continue living in fear. I waited for the right moment. One particularly frigid night, I saw John's SUV pull into its usual spot. My heart pounded in my chest as I prepared myself. I stepped outside, pretending to check the pumps, and saw John watching me from his vehicle. "Hey, John," I called out, waving him over. "I could use a hand with something." He hesitated for a moment, then got out of the SUV and walked toward me. "What's up?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I need some help with one of the pumps," I said, leading him toward the back of the station. "It's been acting up." As we reached the pump, I pulled out my phone and discreetly dialed the local police, keeping the call active in my pocket. "Can you hold this for a second?" I asked, handing him a tool. John took the tool, looking slightly confused. "Sure, but what do you need help with?" I stepped back, putting some distance between us. "Actually, I think there's something else you need to see," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Just then, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. John realized what was happening, his expression shifting to one of anger. "What are you doing, Jake?" "Just making sure I'm safe," I replied, my voice firm. "You've been acting suspiciously, and I had to take precautions." The police arrived quickly, and I explained the situation, showing them the surveillance footage. They took John into custody, and as they drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The nights at the gas station were still cold and long, but now there was a sense of safety. I knew I had done the right thing, trusting my instincts and taking action, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of peace. The night was still and quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound seem amplified. The gas station lights cast long shadows, and I could feel the chill in the air seeping through my jacket. Tonight was the night. I had everything prepared, every detail of my plan meticulously laid out. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding of my heart. My colleague, Tom, was in the back room, ready to call the police at my signal. We had gone over the plan several times, and I knew he was just as anxious as I was. Just after midnight, the familiar black SUV pulled into the lot and parked in its usual spot. I watched from the counter, forcing myself to appear calm and collected. John stepped out of the vehicle, his hood pulled up, and started walking toward the station. "Hey, Jake," he called out, his voice carrying a casual tone. "How's it going?" "Hey, John," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Same old, same old." He approached the counter, and I smiled at him, acting as if nothing was amiss. "I was just thinking," I said, trying to sound spontaneous. "We've got some extra coffee and donuts inside, on the house. You interested?" John hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Free coffee and donuts, huh? What's the occasion?" "Just being friendly," I said, shrugging. "Consider it a thank you for keeping me company these past nights." He seemed to consider it for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, why not? Free stuff is always good." "Great," I said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Follow me." I led him inside the station, my mind racing through the plan. Tom was out of sight, but within earshot, ready to make the call. As we entered the break room, I gestured to the coffee pot and a box of donuts on the table. "Help yourself," I said, trying to keep my tone light and casual. John walked over to the table, his movements deliberate. I could feel the tension in the air, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get him to stay here long enough for the police to arrive. "So, what's your story, John?" I asked, leaning against the counter and folding my arms. "You've been coming here a lot. What brings you out this way every night?" He glanced at me, his expression guarded. "Just like driving at night. Helps me clear my head." I get that, I said, nodding. But it seems like you always end up here. Kind of a coincidence, don't you think? John's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might suspect something. What are you getting at, Jake? Nothing, really, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Just making conversation. Just then, I saw Tom out of the corner of my eye, giving me a subtle nod. It was time. I reached into my pocket and pressed the button on my phone, signaling Tom to call the police. Well, I appreciate the company, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It can get pretty lonely out here. John took a sip of coffee, watching me closely. Yeah, I can imagine. The seconds felt like hours as I waited, hoping the police would arrive quickly. My mind raced with possibilities, every scenario playing out in my head. I just needed to keep him here a little longer. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens pierced the silence. John's eyes widened and he glanced toward the door. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, his tone turning sharp. "Just taking some precautions," I said, my voice firm. "You've been acting suspiciously, and I couldn't take any chances." John's expression darkened, and he took a step toward me. "You set me up?" "I had to," I replied, standing my ground. I didn't know what else to do. Before he could react, the door burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in, their guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of them shouted. John froze, his face a mask of anger and confusion. Slowly, he raised his hands, and the officers moved in to cuff him. As they led him out to the patrol car, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The tension drained from my body, replaced by a profound sense of relief. I had done it. I had caught him. Tom came out from the back room, a look of concern on his face. "You okay, Jake?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "I'm just glad it's over." The police took my statement, and as the SUV disappeared into the night, I knew that the long ordeal had finally come to an end. The gas station felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe, and I knew that I could finally move on from this nightmare. The interior of the gas station felt stifling, the air heavy with tension as John reluctantly agreed to come inside, his demeanor cautious and guarded. I kept my eyes on him, trying to appear calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Thanks for coming in," I said, my voice steady. "Can I get you something? Coffee, maybe?" John hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "No, I'm good," he replied curtly. "What's this all about, Jake?" I took a step closer, keeping a safe distance. "Just wanted to chat," I said casually, trying to buy time. "You know, clear the air." He narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. "This doesn't feel like just a chat," he said, his tone hardening. "What are you playing at?" I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Look, John," I began carefully. "I've been noticing some things lately. Your visits here, they're not just random, are they?" He stiffened, his jaw clenched. "What are you trying to say?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I think you've been watching me," I said, my voice low but firm, "following me, and I can't ignore it anymore." John's eyes narrowed dangerously, and I knew I had to act fast. I subtly gestured to my colleague Tom, who was watching from a distance. He nodded slightly, understanding my signal. "Just stay calm, John," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Let's just talk this out." But John's demeanor was shifting, his suspicion turning to anger. "You set me up!" he accused, his voice rising. "You called the cops, didn't you?" I held his gaze, my heart racing. "I had to," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I had to be sure." Before I could react, John lunged forward, knocking over a display case in his rage. "You think you're so smart," he spat, advancing toward me. "You have no idea what you've started." I backed away, my hands raised defensively. "John, calm down," I urged, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay composed. "Let's just wait for the police to sort this out." But he was beyond reason now, his face contorted with fury. I glanced at Tom, who nodded urgently. It was time. I pressed the button on my phone, signaling Tom to call the police. "Tom's calling them," I said, trying to keep John's attention on me. "Just stay calm." But John was relentless, closing the distance between us. "You ruined everything," he growled, reaching for me. I sidestepped his grasp, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay back, John," I warned, my voice desperate now. "Please." Just then, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as the police cars pulled into the lot. Relief washed over me as officers rushed in, their presence calming the chaotic scene. "Hands up!" one of the officers shouted, drawing his weapon. John froze, realizing the gravity of the situation. He slowly raised his hands, his anger now replaced by resignation. The police quickly moved in, cuffing him and leading him out of the station. As they escorted him away, I sank down onto a nearby chair, my legs weak with relief and exhaustion. Tom came over, his expression filled with concern. "Are you okay, Jake?" I nodded, taking deep breaths to steady myself. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. "I think so." The officers took my statement, and as they finished, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. The ordeal was finally over. I had confronted my fear, faced it head-on, and come out the other side. As I watched John being driven away, I knew that I had done the right thing. And although the memories of those tense nights would linger, I also knew that I could finally start to move forward, free from the shadow of fear that had plagued me for so long.